Well, good afternoon, everyone. While we are waiting for some people, I think we will start slowly the webinar. I'd like to welcome everyone to the 17th webinar in this discussion series on tipping elements, the notion of irreversibility and abrupt changes in the Earth system. My name is Anne Goujon, and I will be the moderator today. The goal of this discussion series is to advance knowledge on tipping elements, support efforts to increase consistency in treatment of tipping elements in the scientific community, develop a research agenda, and design joint experiments and ideas for a tipping element model intercomparison project called TIPMIP. And the networks behind this series are the Earth Commission, AIMS, the Analysis, Integration and Modeling of the Earth System Project, and both AIMS and the Earth Commission are hosted by Future Earth, and the Safe Landing Climate's Lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program. And this event is co-organized by the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, where I'm located, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Change Research, and the Global System Institute at the University of Exeter. So the focus of today's seminar is on education and digitalization. Education, as you know, is a slow diffusion process, mainly because it takes place over a short period of time in schools and universities. But as we know, it can be an important catalyst for the ability to respond to challenges, for example, climate change. And we will hear more about this. Digital innovation also is mostly seen as an enabler and creates new possibilities, among others, for climate change mitigation and adaptation. So I'm sure you are as eager as I am to listen to our two speakers. But before I introduce them, here is some information about the house rules. Both our speakers will present before the Q&A session. However, during their talks, feel free to post questions and indicate to whom your question is directed by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window, which you can see. And everyone can upvote the preferred question, of course. We will then get to this question in a discussion session following the presentation, and following the event today, we will post the recording and the slides on the Tipping Point series Confetti webpage, which link will appear very soon in the chat. So they will be accessible in the future. Now we will go to our speakers after this long introduction. Our first speaker today, and we enchanted to have her, is Raya Muttarak. Raya is a professor of demography at the University of Bologna. She is also principal investigator of the ERC Consolidator Grant PopClima, Population Dynamics under Global Climate Change, which aims to assess and forecast population dynamics under global climate change. Research interests include population, environment, and sustainable development, population heterogeneity and forecasting, differential vulnerability and adaptive capacity, migration and mobility, and health, well-being, and food security. That's plenty of interest, I would say. Thank you for being here, Raya. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, and it looks like I'm doing a lot, but I think I spend most of my time now doing admin work, by the way. But in any case, I am happy to share some of my research interest and the work that I've been doing actually when I was at IIASA in particular over the last 10 years. So let me share the screen. We have practiced that, but it's always struggling to. Okay, so I have that on. I have my slides on. So I do the presentation mode. Yeah. So what I would like to talk about today is to maybe explore, so together with you, or at least to put on the table, that education maybe can potentially be an accelerator for sustainable and also resilient society. So pretty much I would like to touch upon both the sort of the role of education, maybe in enhancing mitigation, and also in enhancing adaptive capacity or reducing vulnerability. So maybe let's start with this. I think it's quite a nice saying. They said it's a Chinese proverb that I'm not sure if you know, just let me know. But pretty much, so this proverb is trying to say that if you give a man a fish, then you feed him for a day. But if you teach him how to fish, or her, him or her, you would feed him or her for a lifetime. So this is kind of reflecting the point that I would like to make, that if one invests in education in general, in human capital, so it may have the long-lasting effect. Also on, not only on, say, we may invest in education because, actually I can come into this slide, which is one of the key of the Sustainable Development Goals 4, ensuring inclusive and equitable education. Well, investing in education itself, it can have an intrinsic value. Actually, for we cannot even think of, some countries does put education as a human right in the constitution. Actually, you have a right to study, so it has a value in itself, that a human being would like to learn, or it can satisfy our knowledge or our human development. But one could also think of education as that education has an instrumental role as well. So in the context of the SDG, or the Sustainable Development Goals, maybe I can put it here. So we may think of the relationship that investing in education, goal 4, it may also have the link with, do you see my screen, the box, the speaker box here, or you don't?
No, it looks fine.
Okay, because I could also reduce it. I think it just will hopefully bother you a bit. It's in the slide, sorry. Yeah, maybe I do it this way. Yeah. Yeah, so I just want to say that we also have quite a lot of evidence, actually, that investing in education as a mean, right? So the instrumental role of education, maybe it also can help to achieve also other sustainable development goals. I mean, it's quite clear if you think about reducing hunger or health, the link, the causal link actually between education and health. It's the evidence is really clear. Even gender equality, and when I was at IIASA, the work that we've done a lot is to try to link education with the goal 13, which is climate action. We have also written a book with a colleague to look at how education can be the enabling factor that to help to achieve the sustainable development agenda. And one thing that I would like to share with you is sort of, why would that be the case, right? So one could think of this kind of mechanisms, or can be directly and indirectly. When we go to school, I mean, we all of us have gone to some kind of education. So we learn how to read, how to write. We learn also how to solve problems. It has, and education can enhance our cognitive skills, but also the abstraction skills. And this is also important. Abstraction skills mean skills that sort of, we don't need to experience certain events, but we can probably imagine how it would look like. One of the classic examples is smoking, for instance. So we tend to find that people with higher level of education, maybe they smoke, maybe they start smoking like the others, but they're more likely to quit earlier, because they don't need to first smoke and then you get sick and then you quit smoking. You can make a sort of link by abstractioning, knowing that smoking is bad. You don't have to get sick to quit smoking. So that's a sort of say directly that when we go to school, we learn a lot of skills there. And also, of course, indirectly, we have all tons of evidence that education, also people tend to, with high level of education, so tend to have better social network, social capital. They know who to ask when you're in trouble, for instance. You know how to borrow, where to borrow money, also higher wealth and access to resources. So that's a kind of the two sides of the positive externality of investing in education. Now I'm going to try to come to why education may be a driver of social change. In our field, in demography, this is no need to emphasize it. It's really clear that the relationship between higher education and the fertility patterns, and pretty much in this graph, it's shown that with the relationship between mean years of schooling on the x-axis, and then the number of children, average number of children per woman on the y-axis. So pretty much once the country start having higher level of education of women age 15 to 44 years old, so the fertility come down. And it's evidence in high income countries or low income countries. middle income countries, as I sort of pick some of them here. This is just to reflecting what I was saying. It's pretty much the same, but it's probably just representing as a bar graph. So if you can see different colors representing different level of education. So the red one, it's showing women with no education, so they haven't gone to school at all. The orange-ish one, it's those with primary level of education, and the blue, the darker the blue is the higher the level of education. And it makes a lot of difference actually when we think about how investing in education today, and it's say about educational diffusion may take time, but we can still change the course of how population would look like in the future, because investing in education today, by 10 years, secondary level education is about 9 years of education. It may change also the human capital and also the fertility or other type of behaviors also. So probably one of the good example is countries like Nigeria, for instance. The women without education have on average almost 7 children per woman, but if she has higher level of a secondary level of education, that would be almost pretty much half, right? So if, of course, COVID did stall the educational expansion, and maybe conflict also does disrupt schooling of people in many different countries, and it can change also the fertility pattern. So it can make a difference if we sort of investing or sustaining female education today. In the next, say, 10 years, or in the next cohort of women may change so that fertility pattern. So that's one side, which the evidence is really clear here. Another thing that I want to point out, it's also if you think about infant or child mortality, in this case, it's under 5 mortality, you also see the similar, really the strong educational gradient. Of course, over the course of time, I just want to highlight that it's great that in general, with or without education, but the trends in the world with improvement in medical facilities or services, but also in the knowledge, and then also I think to a certain extent also to education, we see that over the course of time, under 5 mortality has gone down. So that's a great thing. But we still see quite strong educational gradients. So again, I probably just highlight Nigeria again, because it's kind of quite visible, the pattern here. If you think about the level of under 5 mortality, so the number of death per 1,000 live birth, which is quite high actually, because Nigeria in 1990, it's about 200 children under 5 out of 1,000 births who would die before they reach the age of 5. So that's huge, actually. That's high number. So 1990, if you think about 1990 in Nigeria, already the women with higher level of education would experience it's still high, it's over 100, but women with secondary level of education, there would be roughly 100, 110, 120 under 5 mortality per 1,000 live births. And it takes people with primary education to reach that point in 2018, right? So we can already see that in mother with high level of education, that they experience much lower child mortality there. So I think it's just to show that the power of education in assimilating this kind of, it's improved health, social change, children die less, and so on. Now I want to come a bit closer to the interest that we have. So why education may matter for climate change mitigation. It's a similar mechanisms that I said, that we typically find that people with higher level of education also tend to have higher different risk perception. They have higher awareness or concern about the environment or climate change. Of course, one has to think that if you, I think it's important also to think that people with high education tend to have high income. If you already satisfy your material needs, so you have food to eat, you have a shelter, you have clothes to wear, and then, okay, you have more space also to think about the environment, and that's kind of that's what we find. Actually, higher education is linked to more concern about climate change, and maybe also higher action that people take to reduce their impact. And they also, of course, with income, that's mean they probably can afford to buy the electric car, for instance. That's also quite important to change the behavior. And we find for instance in this European data, on the y-axis, we see the number of actions that people report that they do to fight climate change, to reduce climate change. On the x-axis, that's the, it's not the number of years of schooling, sorry, that's the way the data is structured. It's when people left school. So pretty much the blue one would represent those who left school at the age of 15 years, and the green one would represent those who left school at age 20 years or older, so pretty much the tertiary level of education. So in this graph, what I'm showing is as we may expect, people who report that they're concerned about climate change on the x-axis, then the higher the concern about the climate change, we see the positive relationship with the number of actions that they take to reduce climate change. But we also see that educational gradient here, but if people stay longer in school, if they leave school at the age 20 years or over, they would do even more, right? So given the same level of concern, we still see more actions that they do. This may be a bit of a soft thing, because you may say that, well, actually higher education so come with higher, I think many of us do take the flight at the overseas flight or transatlantic flight quite a lot. It's true that people higher education tend to come with higher income, and maybe the lifestyle that also lead to higher carbon emissions, but it's still kind of relatively debatable. I think the evidence it's around that point for the moment. Do we see the environmental Kuznets curve or not? Same as GDP. Of course, it depends a lot on what year or what country, what the subset of countries that you use for analysis. But there's starting to be some kind of evidence showing that yes, it's true that carbon emissions increase with GDP, carbon emission increase with the years with education, but at a certain level, we may see it start coming down. So we start seeing the curve, and some evidence also point to that direction. I would say that this is the frontier that we probably need more and more refined research as well, because it's still kind of the evidence is still mixed around here. But maybe it is not too wrong to think that we may see that, we accept it, that it would increase with the level of education, but at some point we also think that the education may push or drive people to make a change also. So yeah, so that's a point that I was making. Would we observe that environmental Kuznets curve or not? Now I want to move on to another side that I also want to talk about, also the role of education in reducing vulnerability. And this is the line of research that we started, I think, pretty much about 10 years ago. It wasn't that fashionable to think that education may play a role in climate change adaptation, particularly in reducing vulnerability. So we started. I would like to acknowledge Wolfgang Lutz, who's really pioneer on this topic. So we collected. We had a special issues published in the journal Ecology and Society. Now it's been 10 years, actually, more or less, that we have this evidence. But now it's quite clear, it's on the table, that we did find, both in the subset of less developed countries, lower income countries, industrialized countries, and also in all sort of outcome, in all sort of levels of analysis that we did. It can be individual, household, community, or national. But the evidence kind of point out that communities or household or countries with higher level of education tend to have lower vulnerability. Of course, it varies by the outcome we measure, but they tend to have higher level of disaster preparedness. They tend to suffer less loss and damage, and then also quicker in terms of recovery. So it seems to be consistent, and the evidence tend to point in this direction, that education can play a role in reducing vulnerability. I just give you some of the example that that my colleague did, actually. So that's so we look at, so also they look at the death from climate-related disaster on the y-axis, so that's death, and on the x-axis we have the proportion of women in different countries, aged 20 to 39 years old with at least secondary level of education, and then I just highlighted some of the countries here in Central America, so Haiti, Dominican Republic, and Cuba, which you think that maybe they may have pretty much similar exposure to storms, right? So to the cyclones and the big storms. But you can see that the disaster death in Cuba is much lower, and Cuba tend to have actually higher level of women in Cuba have higher level of education than Dominican Republic and Haiti. So we see quite a strong linear relationship there as well, just an example. And this is my own work actually that I just want to highlight as well, that I was mentioning that education may play a role in enhancing disaster preparedness. And we find a consistent evidence both in the Philippines and Thailand. Disaster preparedness refers to the action that household or individual take to reduce the impact of disaster. So it can be you have the house insurance, or you may in certain areas, so it's recommended, if you live in the earthquake zone, for instance, it's recommended that you should have the emergency kits that you prepare, such as the 72 hours, you should be able to survive with your own water, your own food supply, the medicine, or even the radio, and then that kind of type of behavior, or you know where to go if disasters strike, you and people in your household know where to go. So that's our mission, and that's the outcome, is a disaster preparedness. And you may imagine, yes, if people have disaster experience, if they have experienced disaster before, like in the Philippines, for instance, the level of disaster preparedness is high because the Philippines, as we know, is one of the countries that get exposed regularly every year, or maybe throughout the year, or so, to different kind of natural hazards. So it's not surprising that people with disaster experience also have really high proportion or probability of preparing for disaster. It's almost 80%, 90% there. And that's not surprising, same as in Thailand. The interesting part is the one on the left. For the group of people who have never experienced disaster before, and then I plot the years of schooling there on the x-axis. So what we see is, as years of schooling increase, the level of disaster preparedness also increase with the years of schooling. And the interesting part is around here, right? So those in the those with, say, from 12 to 15 years of schooling, their level of disaster preparedness, it's the same with people who have disaster experience. So it pretty much, I want to come back to these abstraction skills that I mentioned, that so schooling can actually probably substitute disaster experience. So you don't have to first experience a disaster and then you think that, okay, it's dangerous, and I start preparing, but probably with some changes in risk perception or understanding or know what to do, then it can substitute also the experience of disaster, which is a good thing, because we don't want people to experience bad things first and learn and then change their behavior, right? So schooling may substitute that. And we can even unpack actually what are the pathways through which education may affect disaster preparedness. So we did some analysis to unpack that, and then we found that it's also education. People tend to have higher risk perception. They're more aware about climate change. They also have more enhanced social networks that can enable them to do disaster preparedness. So there are probably other things as well, but this is what we capture in the data. So I'm almost done, and I think I need 2 more minutes, if that's fine. So I just want to highlight the last piece of evidence that we have. We also look at how the relationship between exposure to some kind of climatic shocks and stunting. If I think many of you know, but maybe I just want to emphasize the meaning of, so stunting means it's a kind of indicators of child undernutrition or undernourishment. So typically for children of certain age, we would expect that they would reach the average height of the children, that pretty much we use the data from the World Health Organization that collect the sort of the average height that children of different age should reach, right? And in this particular case, you can see that this group of children, they're shorter than the height that they're supposed to reach, and so they are stunted, so too short for their age, yeah, as too short for the age. It can be, some people use it, or many people use it as an indicator of chronic undernutrition or chronic malnutrition, because if you don't reach the height that you're supposed to reach, so probably you don't have enough nutrition, and it can have really, really long-lasting effect also on cognitive development, and also when people measure the outcome maybe 20 years later, it can affect also your health, higher risk of mortality, occupational outcome, your income, and so on. So it actually, I think investing in nutrition is also important, because it's something that we can try to reduce, right? We know that undernutrition is still a problem in many parts of the world, and regardless of climate change. That's why I want to say that reducing malnutrition is also a very important thing to do, because it can change the course of life of many children. But what I want to point out is there is some relationship also between stunting and exposure to some climatic shocks. It differs by country, by the way. So in Ethiopia, the indicator that we use here is it's a pretty much amount of rainfall. So 0 represents the normal kind of rainfall patterns, the normal condition, and the plus would mean a bit too much rain, and the minus sign means too little rain. You can think of it this way. And the y-axis, I'm showing the probability of children being stunted. So Ethiopia case is different from India. We have to think also these two countries are also in different climatic zone, have different exposure. So in Ethiopia, it's a sort of the drought condition that is bad for children. It's under 5. For India, it's more like too much rain is not good. But what I want to highlight, so now we're going to zoom into India a little bit and look at this graph on the right. We can also distinguish actually the household that get exposed to this rainfall, shock rainfall anomalies, and distinguish between the level of education of the mother and also the household wealth. And I think what is interesting is the one in the middle that I sort of highlight with my circle here. So here, I think it's not surprising for the red group, for instance, if I look at the mother with low level of education and from the poor household, of course, the probability of the child being stunted when they get exposed to too much rain is high. Well, they're poor and the mother have low level of education, but the interesting group is here, the one that I highlighted in the middle. When the mother have high education but poor, the chance of the children being stunted, it's the same as the household when the mother is rich but with low education. So this is the point I want to make, that maybe this giving money to people, yeah, it probably can help them 1 or 2 days, right, until the money runs out. But if you invest in education, and this is the point, it would have a long-lasting effect, because once people have some level of education, I don't think it's going to go away from their brain. It's going to stay. So it's not the same as giving money people, so to 2 people. So I think that's the point I want to make. And I need 1 more minute just to say it can be a catalyst for social change, because we also know that if we invest today, that's also by Wolfgang Luther, the theory of demographic metabolism, because population, the younger population at some point would replace the older one, right? So the older one would exit from this population, but the older one would die, and then the new one would be born. So if the new one are more educated, they have more and they also, a new generation also get exposed to different things. For instance, it's that we have clear evidence that the younger generation tend to be more concerned about climate change compared to the older one, and so on. So with the generational change, with higher education, so it can possibly lead to a social change in different way that I was talking about. And I think at this point, I want to stop here so I don't take too much time. I stop sharing as well.
Thank you very much, Raya. Thank you for this very rich talk, very convincing as well. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A box, and we will address them during the discussion session following the next speaker, which is my pleasure to introduce as well. Ridhi Kashyap. It's also wonderful to have you with us today. Ridhi is Professor of Demography and Computational Social Science at the University of Oxford. Her research spans different areas, as well, many areas of demography. Questions are linked to mortality, population health, gender inequality, marriage and family, and migration and ethnicity. A central interest of her research has been to leverage computational approaches for demographic research within the growing area of digital and computational demography, and forge links between demography and growing interdisciplinary community of computational social science. Within the Leverhulme Center for Demographic Science, she co-leads the strand on digital and computational science. She's interested in the impacts of mobile and internet technologies and digitalization more broadly on demographic and sustainable development outcomes such as gender inequalities, population health, and empowerment. She's very active on the methodology side, and she's interested there in how computational methods, for instance, Asian-based model, microsimulation, machine learning, and new data streams such as the digital trace data from the web and from the social media can contribute to the study of population dynamics and social inequalities. That's why we are very proud to have her here today with us. And Ridhi, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Anne. Can you confirm that you can see my screen?
It's perfect.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, thanks very much, Anne, for this very generous introduction. And I'm very excited to speak in this webinar series today. Unlike Raya, the first speaker, I'm not a climate scientist, or I'm not a demographer working directly on climate change. But of course, it is an issue that is central to the way that we think about social and fundamental challenges of our time. So I think all of us should be thinking about climate science and ways to build climate resilience. What I want to try and do in my talk today is think more broadly about the role of digital technologies for promoting social tipping and sustainability and resilience in societies, drawing on a bit from my own research where I've been thinking about the impacts of digitalization for social demographic and sustainable development outcomes. But this presentation is framed, as you can see in the title, as a question. It asks, can digital technologies promote social tipping for sustainability and climate resilience? So I'm going to sketch out some potential pathways that I think are relevant for us to think about when thinking about the relationship between digitalization, digital technologies, social tipping in relation to climate resilience. But at the same time, I'm going to also complicate this picture at the end by saying that the path is not straightforward between digital technologies, digitalization, and sustainability and climate resilience. And that's sort of where I'm going to leave it, because I think the empirical evidence is still very tenuous on which directions these effects can go. So before I go further, let's start by thinking about the whole concept of social tipping, which, as this review by Milkwright and colleagues in Environmental Research Letters sketches out, since the early 2000s, there's been a lot of interest, both across the physical as well as the social sciences, in this idea of tipping points. And tipping points in sort of the socio-ecological systems, Milkwright and colleagues say, is a small quantitative change that inevitably triggers a non-linear change in the social component of the social ecological system, driven by self-reinforcing positive feedback mechanisms that inevitably and often irreversibly lead to a quantitatively different state of the social system. So there are sort of three key ideas here. There's a small change that triggers a large nonlinear change, which is driven by some kind of a reinforcing mechanism. So there's this idea that there's a rapid change driven by some kind of diffusion process that results in irreversibility, a radical change in a system. Now, in the broader social and psychological sciences, or the social and behavioral sciences, I'd say there are many different notions of tipping or tipping points, so social tipping points. But one general characterization that seems to be emerging, particularly in the literature on social norms, and especially in the behavioral tradition, is this idea of social tipping as one where small masses or critical masses of minorities can trigger large-scale social change, large-scale social behavioral change, and that they can shift behavioral patterns which normally are underpinned by a shared understanding of what are acceptable actions, and they're sustained by forms of social interaction, but there are some conditions under which these norms can change. And that's sort of been the general understanding in the social and behavioral literature investigating this idea of social tipping. Seems to be a growing consensus around sort of one way to think of social tipping. What at the base of this idea of large-scale social behavioral change, well, what causes it? There are sort of broad three factors that trigger these changes. So on the one hand, the idea of a nonlinear change evokes that there is sort of a rapid diffusion of flows of information about a new behavior that flows through different social networks, and then that can essentially result in forms of contagion, right? So social contagion processes. So the first is there has to be some kind of a social network effect in which there is new flows of information, that there is a spread that triggers this change. In addition to sort of just pure, contagion information flows, we're also expecting social influence processes are at play here. So that's both forms of social learning, but also influence. So my behavior influences other people's behaviors. And this again is, social networks are key to this, social network processes. And again, more broadly in thinking about the spread of new behaviors, another idea that emerges, especially in the literature looking at social networks and social network effects on the adoption of new behaviors, particularly studies that have tried to do this in large-scale field experiments, they find that sometimes social reference, particularly people who are key influencers within networks, sometimes this is called a role model effect, are very important for spreading new behaviors, right? So the idea here again being that sometimes small shifts can trigger big ones, but social network and social interaction processes are crucial for these large-scale behavioral changes that trigger changes within social system. Now, there are a number of examples of different types, again, drawing on observational data, but also drawing on large-scale field experiments and interventions that have tried to sort of explore these social diffusion or social contagion processes where such changes happen. But drawing on examples as a demographer, as a population scientist, I think it's useful to think of one of the most fundamental changes that have taken place in the last 50 to 70 years across the world, which is this radical decline in the number of children per woman, the fertility transition, where we see that globally, if we look in the early 1950s, there were about 6 children per woman on average. And now if we look in the 2020s, we're looking at just around 2 children per woman at the global level. This is a remarkable change that has taken place within, again, a fairly short time span. And when we think about this sort of global fertility transition, the fact that this is, as this graph here shows, been a universal phenomenon across the world, and the fact that it's taken place across a range of socioeconomic circumstances, across a constellation of levels of economic and social development, the fact that this trajectory has been so universal clearly shows that this has been a radical shift in social norms. Something has fundamentally changed about social norms. And here, again, the idea of networks, social networks and social interaction effects has really been described as an important way in which to interpret these changes. So if we can think of the diffusion of new ideas about family size and the adoption of new technological innovations like contraception, the spread of new behaviors through social networks and the information exchange that is enabled by social networks, which allow for the learning of new behaviors, called social learning, and the influence of one's behavior on other people in one's network. This is sometimes also called social influence. This has also been a central way to understand these large-scale fertility changes in the demographic literature. And here, again, networks seem to matter. So in this study by Hans-Peter Kohler and colleagues, looking at probability of adopting contraception in Kenya, they find that in less dense networks, we actually see that more people having adopted contraception has sort of nonlinear impacts on the adoption of contraception within communities, rather than in more dense networks. And the way they interpret that is that information flows or information sources are more diverse in less dense networks than in more dense ones. However, more dense networks, particularly when there's been a sort of threshold of a certain large fraction having already adopted it, as this right panel shows, network effects in dense networks enhance contraceptive adoptions when networks are dense, when a certain large threshold of adopters have already been reached. So at different stages of a diffusion process, network structures can matter differently. Initially, diverse flows of information can enhance acceleration of information flows and allow for learning about new behaviors, whereas dense networks can matter at later stages of diffusion to make diffusion complete. Now, this is again in relation to thinking about the adoption of contraceptive behaviors. In a linked way, thinking again about how do people learn about new things before they spread them to others, a large literature again within the demographic tradition on fertility, on understanding fertility change, has argued that new ideas come from mass media and new technologies. In particular, there has been influential papers that show that cable TV and soap operas change how people think about ideal family size and have impacts on the number of children. So papers from Brazil, papers from India that show that perceptions about gender norms and women's role in the family, as well as how many children they should have been affected by the images that they see, which then they, through social interaction with their friends and neighbors, those social contagion processes are then activated, allowing for the diffusion of new norms and new ideas. Now, that's about fertility, that's about a population indicator. But interestingly, we see, as this figure shows, similar contagion processes also when we think about the adoption of solar panels. Right. This is data from Solar City, which is one of the largest providers of solar panels across the US. And we see here the yellow dots are ordinary customers who bought it themselves, but then we actually see that there are many more green dots by the end than there are yellow dots. And that's again a social contagion, a social network process where someone refers their friend or their neighbor, so that when I get it, my neighbors and my networks around me get it, such that the spread and the diffusion of this process happens in a non-linear way, in a way that is much faster and much more spatially diverse than would be the case if only individuals themselves were adopting a behavior. Right, so this is sort of giving you a broader way of thinking about how social tipping is activated through social networks, social interaction, through information flows within social networks. And there's clearly a literature that points to the importance of these network and informational exchanges through network effects. So I said that this talk was going to be about digitalization. Where does digitalization fit into this? And if we think about the 21st century, this is the century of the digital revolution. And this figure here shows us the information and communication technology subscriptions per capita globally from the 1990s onward. And we see that this is a rapid technological diffusion of mobile in red, and also internet technologies, and then eventually by the mid-2000s, mobile internet technologies. And if we look at this graph of these technologies across different regions of the world, we see that this is really a global diffusion process. No region of the world has been untouched by the diffusion of mobile and internet technologies. And many parts of the world, such as in Asia and Africa, that never had landlines as a basic mode of telecommunication in there at all, have essentially just for the first time obtained large-scale telecommunication infrastructure through mobile. So that has been the first crucial stage of their telecommunication development, is the advent of mobile. Now, if we think about some of the broader mechanisms through which the social tipping literature within the social sciences is thinking about the diffusion of new behaviors, social interaction, social feedback effects, digital technologies can, in many different ways, come into the picture and affect these processes. So in the first way, we can think about digital technologies as improving access to information and allow for awareness raising, right? But particularly in parts of the world where these are the first way in which we have access to large-scale informational and communication flows, this is really a transformative technology. So we can think about informational diffusion as well as these new forms of social learning processes that are activated because of the internet and mobile phones. We can also think about the activation of social interaction processes because of improved connectivity, as well as access to broader networks. So coming back to the study on contraceptive transitions, where we see that less dense network with more weak ties are the ones where we see information flows moving faster because there's diversity of information sources available. Those kinds of processes can exactly be activated in a more accelerated way through the internet and mobile phones. We have essentially a diversifying ecosystem of information, but also of connectivity, which is no longer geographically constrained. We also get, through digital technologies, an expansion of the lives of others that we are exposed to. We can get more globalized media content, particularly more globalized media than you would in, for example, local television or local radio. So we really have the world and world narratives in our hands through our devices. And lastly, and this is, I think, a really key way in which, at least in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, we see the discussion of digital technologies. We see digital technologies of different types as promoting access to key services and infrastructures that can enable different forms of economic and social resilience. So a simple example would be mobile money, which can, for example, allow for smoothing of consumption or dealing with financial shocks, particularly around times of climate hazards. But there could also be other examples where artificial intelligence systems or the Internet of Things, that is the integration of digital and physical infrastructures, can enable clearer and more accessible warning signs that again can help communities build forms of climate resilience. So that's in a sort of in a more straightforward physical infrastructure resilience way. We can think of technologies as promoting paths to allowing for better information systems that can help for better planning, particularly in hazardous situations. So these are just sort of four pathways through which we can think about digital technologies as having broader social impacts. Now, in some of the research that I've done with colleagues, we do actually find that the diffusion of mobile phones is having significant impacts on sustainable development outcomes, particularly in the context of low and middle income countries, where the associations between digitalization and a range of sustainable development outcomes linked to population health, women's empowerment, and reproductive and sexual health are the strongest. So in this figure, we see the association between mobile phone subscriptions and gender inequality and contraceptive prevalence. And we see really strong associations, in fact, the strongest associations in countries with at the lowest and low per capita income levels. We see similar associations also with child and maternal mortality, sort of SDG outcomes linked to population health, which suggests the powerful role of digitalization in improving, again, through channels of improved connectivity, informational access, as well as service provision, significant impacts on SDG outcomes. When we move forward, and this is at the aggregate level that we see these impacts, we also see, when we analyze this at the individual level using survey data, we find that people in the poorest parts of the world, so this is an analysis on 7 sub-Saharan African countries, we see that women are actively adopting mobile phones for key life decisions linked to financial transactions, linked to family planning, such that those who are owning mobile phones are experiencing key life benefits through these technologies. And when we analyze the association between mobile phones and a range of outcomes linked to decision-making surrounding contraception, around knowledge of contraception, around knowledge around where to seek information about accessing HIV care, as well as antenatal care, as well as being able to make large household decisions linked to health and purchases, we find that women who own mobile phones have, in general, positive outcomes, are more likely to experience boosts through technologies, such as mobile phones. So there is a strong correlation, which in this case, because of the research design that we use, we're able to make a claim that this is plausibly even a causal effect, because we create a natural experiment set up in our design, where we find that places where lightning strikes happen more, mobile phone towers break down, which gives us a plausibly exogenous source of variation to be able to make a causal claim about the relationship between mobile phones and these health and women's empowerment outcomes. We also look and we find that the poorest areas are the ones where these payoffs to digitalization are the largest. So we find that those where the local development levels are the poorest, we find that the payoffs to technology, so those who own phones, are the ones that experience these benefits most prominently. And in a completely different analysis, which actually looks at the relationship between internet and mobile connectivity and the intention to migrate, we again find these differential heterogeneous effects, where we find that those that have lower access to education experience the biggest boosts to digital connectivity, such that who conventionally lack resources and networks through other channels, such as education, through more cost-efficient information gathering mechanisms enabled by digital technologies, experience larger boosts from digitalization. So again, so far what I've done is painted an extremely positive picture about what digital technologies can do and the ways in which they can be accelerators for social tipping processes through the different channels that I've outlined. But I should note now a couple of bottlenecks that I think are relevant for thinking about the role for digitalization and digital technologies in this landscape. First is that digital technology access, internet and mobile access, is uneven. And so in some of the work that I've been doing, we document that there are significant gender gaps in internet and mobile access, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So in this map from our website, digitalgendergaps.org, we see here the blues correspond to parity, female to male ratios of internet and mobile access as being equal. But in countries of Africa, as well as in South Asia, we see that these oranges correspond to women having much less access to mobile phones and being much less likely to be online. So potentially the most vulnerable groups are also the ones that are also digitally excluded. So stand to not benefit from some of these broader mechanisms that I've outlined. Secondly, we also find that with a growing saturation, or with the growing diversification of the digital landscape, there are various types of internet technologies, and in particular various types of social media technologies, and they themselves have been characterized as proliferating misinformation, forms of political polarization, and sustaining echo chambers, that is, forms of self-selection or segregation in online networks, such that the actual cross-cutting diffusion of new ideas and flows is hampered in this way that would allow for forms of social change to occur. And so this is a paper by Williams and colleagues that shows, for example, looking at Twitter across different hashtags like climate change, global warming, and anthropogenic global warming, we see that indeed in some cases between activists and skeptics, clear bifurcation or self-segregation of these social networks. But at the same time, we also see, interestingly, that there are also cases where there are open forums, where there are forums of exchange, where both activists and skeptic communities are embedded and interacting with each other. So there isn't really a sort of straightforward, pure story of only echo chambers. There are also open forums, and there are also clearly cases where there is also forms of community bifurcation and the segregation of networks. What's interesting to think about as well is to what extent is online mobilization, which social media, for example, enables, is online mobilization purely an online phenomenon, and to what extent does it have offline spillovers and forms of collective mobilization dynamics for offline protest as well? And in an interesting study here that looks at the Fridays for Future climate movement that has been spurred across Europe, in particular by Greta Thunberg, we see that a lot of offline protesters actually who join and commit to local protest are actually deriving their information online. So in these surveys that were done across several European cities, Wallström and colleagues found that online social media amongst school students as well as adults was the most prominent source of information for actually learning about and joining local protests. So there's clearly some evidence here that new groups are being mobilized through online media, such as adolescents in particular, who are much more digitally engaged and digitally savvy. And they're organizing not just online, but are also organizing such that there's a local dimension to mobilization that is also occurring because of digitalization. So just to summarize, what I've tried to argue here is that digital technologies have the potential to amplify information dissemination, connect and mobilize communities, and expand access to vital services that are relevant for building climate resilience and preparedness. And some of our research looking at the broader impacts of digitalization for sustainable development suggests that there are important sources of heterogeneity in these impacts, such that those that are traditionally with fewer networks and resources, such as those in low and middle income countries, as well as women, are the ones who stand to benefit the most from the additional access to information, services, and resources that digital technologies provide in a more cost-efficient way. However, some of these benefits aren't fully realized because digital divides persist. And it's important to recognize, as I've tried to hint at with the discussion around misinformation and echo chambers, that there are both positive as well as negative feedback mechanisms that can be at play at the same time. Social tipping doesn't entirely have to be a socially positive. It doesn't have to be social tipping with positive feedback. It can also result in negative social tipping processes. And that's something as a whole, which is, gives us a sense of, I guess, cautious optimism. There are many mechanisms through which we can imagine positive social changes can occur, but at the same time, there are bottlenecks that we have to confront. And there isn't, at the moment at least, a very clear empirical base that allows us to understand under what conditions in the real world, not just in sort of an agent-based model or an experimental setup, social tipping can actually activate the kinds of positive diffusion processes that we'd like to see. So on that perhaps less optimistic note, let me end and say thank you, and I look forward to your questions in the Q&A.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the excellent talk, Ridhi, and which I think complemented very well the first presentation by Raya, and I really liked your focus on the importance of hub networks. That was very well done. So now we will be taking questions for both speakers. We have 2 questions in the chat at the moment in the Q&A box. The first one is not very clear to me, I must say, but the question is about Extinction Rebellion, who has a training page who suggests that 3.5% of the general population is a significant turning point according to social science research. Is this number that you find also, have you found also in your research? I don't know if any of one of you want to take that question.
So I'm happy to take that question. I think you know, in some of this this literature on tipping, you know, this question more broadly is about, you know, what is the number, what is the fraction of a process, what is a fraction of a population that needs to experience or have some kind of a attitudinal change or a behavior that is different, that then this can result in the kind of diffusion process that results in a large scale adoption. And my reading of the literature is that we actually don't have a clear threshold of that in a non-controlled environment. So there are some experimental studies, for example, by Damon Centola and colleagues, that shows that, you know, we may have tipping processes that that are activated around, you know, 25 or 30% of a population being exposed to something. But again, these are all done in sort of relatively small scale, experimental, controlled, either lab setups, or they're done in the case of sort of micro interventions linked to no longer sort of long-term behavior. So I think that's one of the big challenges with this, is that a lot of this work, we don't really know on an empirical footing what is the turning point. And that turning point could also be different for different social processes. Increasingly also, a lot of the work from the social and behavioral sciences, another issue that it raises is when we do see social change or the adoption of new behaviors, how can we be sure that it's a long-term change that will last beyond the duration of, you know, a few weeks, for example. So I think some of these challenges about the longevity of effects, about the transferability across different contexts, do things go from a controlled experimental setup to the real world, where people are more complex, people have more heterogeneous preferences, they have strong group identities. You know, I think it's much more complex. So that's my reading of the literature, that there is no one cutoff or threshold. Not a satisfying answer, but at least sadly, that's how I see the literature at the moment.
Thank you, Ridhi. Do you have anything to add, Raya, about that, or no? Okay. Thank you. We have. There was a question, but Raya answered it online, so that's live. That's good. The other question that is more for Ridhi as well is, because digital technologies strengthen social learning and influence social behaviors, how would you curb the negative consequence, like increasing misinformation and sustainable consumption patterns? And like possibly as well the cost to the carbon footprint of the ICT sector, which is also something that could be interesting.
Yeah, maybe on the cost of the carbon footprint with the ICT sector, maybe I can leave that to Raya. But I think to the point about, you know, how would we curb the sort of what I call the bottlenecks or the negative consequences in terms of misinformation. I think, you know, clearly, so there's sort of both interventions at the level of both individuals, educational institutions, as well as technology companies that I think have an important role to play here. The level of individuals, clearly, I think, you know, digital literacy of different types is really key, right? Learning how to make sense of and also be aware of the different types of information that we are exposed to through different platforms, being aware of also how our information is being used to also show us different types of content can be really relevant for understanding and making sense of the information landscape that we're exposed to, particularly, for example, through social media. And I think particularly in the context of COVID, we saw that a lot of social media companies themselves started implementing interventions where they started labeling posts For example, Twitter implemented a feature where it asked you to, it asked you before you retweeted something whether you had actively read it or not. So that was an intervention that, for example, was implemented very much in the context of COVID and concerns about misinformation. And I think more broadly, in a post-COVID world, the discussion surrounding misinformation has also matured. Both at the level of individuals understanding that this is a big issue, but also at the level of technology companies, at least recognizing that they have a role to play in navigating and sustaining this the digital ecosystem. So I think there are also other kinds of, we can think about interventions within schooling institutions as well. There are examples now of within in educational institutions, school students being primed to, for example, evaluate different sources of information in meaningful ways. And I think those are the kinds of things we can start doing within school settings. We can, make people understand ways to navigate information better. And if, as Raya was saying, education is a crucial part of building resilience. And resilience in our digital age, information acquisition and processing is a really important part of being resilient. So I think all of these different points of intervention are very relevant in thinking about sort of how do we manage and curb the consequences. That being said, I mean, clearly, with all new technologies, there are always enormous benefits to be had, but there are also reasons for us to be cautious. And I think digital technologies in that way are no different.
Yes, thank you. Raya, would you like to add to this?
I guess, and on your point about the role of the IT technology, I think it's probably going to the general discussion also of where the energy use come from, and that would be the key. And then also I think in the IT sector, which I also don't quite understand, I go back to really like when we email too much, and that's also can cause some footprint, right? I think I thought it would, and probably in the storage part or something. And that I kind of think that because now we start talking a lot in terms of the production and consumption about circular economy, how do we recycle things, but I would have no idea about in terms
how to recycle emails.
Yeah. That's one thing. But also I think it also comes to digital technology in a sense of but that would go into the discussion on capitalism also, like if you think about the mobile phone that we should change every 1 year or 2 years, and I think it's a bigger debate which sit within the context of our consumption and production, really. So maybe I go to really how do we
well, I mean, I think it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I think some of the most powerful effects that you see, as I was trying to illustrate, that some of the most powerful effects that we actually see, for example, from mobile phones are not from very sophisticated mobile phones, but actually from often very, basic feature phones in contexts where they enable connectivity, information exchange, because of, for example, living in a rural area, having a mobile phone suddenly means you can access a healthcare worker living not in your immediate geographical vicinity, or you can learn about, for example, family planning through simple things like text messages and a phone call, right? So it's actually not extremely complex smartphones. Okay, smartphones bring with themselves also, other arrays of benefits, but actually very simple interventions can actually go a long way too. So coming back to the point about do we really need, a new phone a year? Actually, the most basic connectivity benefits, the most basic informational benefits are actually being provided now with fairly straightforward devices, and that have become very cheap and become much more affordable. And I think that's something to bear in mind, is that I think it's not clear to me that that as our digital ecosystem matures, we might start seeing more and more competing and heterogeneous effects that are much more complex and not necessarily purely positive, but at least for some of the most positive effects that we see in most disadvantaged communities, they're actually coming from what we would now consider fairly low-tech tech. So I think that's just something to think more broadly about, that, connectivity doesn't need to be very sophisticated anymore.
Maybe I want to reflect a bit on that point too, on another work actually. So our colleagues at IIASA, Shinari Pachai, also did the work that look at because the discussion is if, say, everyone in India would have access to electricity, or what would be the carbon emissions, but actually her work also show that connect people to the electricity. It's actually not everyone gonna have a dishwasher, washing machine, and all this equipment that we're gonna have, right? It gives people like a children with a light bulb that they can do homework.
Yeah. I mean, I think exactly. And I think that's just a bigger discussion in general, right? I mean, we know that very small parts of the world emit a lot. That's also a question about, about wealth inequalities. And that's more a question about also, as you said, capitalism, wealth inequalities, and the distribution of resources. So that's not an argument to say we shouldn't digitalize or we shouldn't electrify. It's more a question about inequalities in distributions. So it's a linked but separate issue.
Thank you. I think Narelle wanted, who is also an organizer of this webinar, wanted to intervene. Narelle, would you like?
No, I didn't.
Oh, I don't know. Somehow it said that you wanted to answer a question. Okay.
No, I was just marking them off for you.
Okay, sorry. There's also an interesting question about the role of governments in these social network processes. What could be the role of governments, or if they should have a role in these social network processes? I guess, I mean, for education, it's rather clear, like governments usually are the one who are investing in education, but for what would be the role for digitalization?
I mean, I think, on the one hand, if we take the idea that digitalization can accelerate the spread of information through social networks, and can also enable connectivity across both weak and strong ties, then of course governments have a role to play in accelerating and improving digital infrastructures, and also have an important role to play in ensuring that those who currently don't have access to it but stand to benefit a lot from it, in the same way that those who don't have access to education stand to benefit a lot from it, as Raya's work is showing. Similarly, I'm trying to make the point that for those who don't have access to mobile phones, having a mobile phone can open up the world in new ways for them, but for often costs, issues linked to cost and access, they can't get access to them. So things like, obviously, improvements in infrastructure and subsidies that allow for improved connectivity can have big payoffs, particularly for those that are currently digitally excluded, which often in low and middle income countries is, for example, women. So that's just one way in which you could interpret the bigger point that I made. But but even if coming back to, for example, the sort of the solar panels example, where we see a contagion process, where we see me adopting something has an impact on my network neighbors also adopting something, right? I mean, all of this requires that the sort of basic threshold to my adoption, i.e., that it shouldn't be too costly for at least someone to adopt it, right? So governments have a role to play, in the same way that in the discussions around decarbonization, we know that there are important roles to be played by things like carbon taxes, and there are, governments can play an important role in the way that they create financial incentives for the adoption of certain kinds of behaviors, right? The same kinds of arguments also apply in thinking about, we need to make things easier to adopt, and then, of course, expect then at some point that these network externalities will come into play. But there first needs to be a basic threshold of adoption amongst some groups first, for which, of course, clear economic incentives, which are in the hands of governments, are really key. Providing, for example, solar panel subsidies helps.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted also reacting on what you said about in different settings, or a little smartphone. I mean, a little phone can help a lot. And I was thinking about what does it mean if we translate this into education? So, I mean, where we have in many countries in the global south, so education has not the same quality as it has in some other countries, and where maybe the content of education is as well not as relevant to the skills that you would need to face the challenges. So how do you see this, Raya, in your research, or is it something that you think is important, or is it just having access to the education itself?
Oh, and you raised a question that you are doing the
research. I wanted to answer that question, actually.
You should answer this, because I certainly, and it's really sitting on this topic, but because I think that's the point, that our work didn't extend to the quality, which is, if you think about the sustainable development goals, also say about access to education, but also quality. And we don't really measure that, because we know that in some countries, like the classroom of 100 students, what do you learn from there? So, and I'm asking back to explain a bit more from your work, that you find some differences for sure, right?
Yes, I mean, it's not obvious. I mean, there's some research on fertility that so far hasn't shown that you would see really an impact of low quality. So it's, I mean, one of the main feature of that we see, for instance, with fertility is like getting the girls outside of the house and exposing them, and then bringing them to meet other people, and who will have this influence through what Ridhi was saying, through this network. So being exposed to other ideas and so on. So that might be part of the importance. But then when it comes to the skills acquired, and I mean the cognitive skills and the quality of literacy, then I think this has huge implication in terms of employability, and how you can how you can learn further, upgrade your skills in the future, and so on. So I think this is important. I think maybe we haven't seen exactly what it might mean in terms of demography yet, but we might see it at a later point. There's another question for Ridhi. What differences, if any, do you see in the reach and impact of more high-tech solutions when compared to mobile phones and the internet in the promotion of social tipping? Well, that's a difficult one, I think.
Well, I mean, I think I think in the case of sort of AI systems, I mean, I think AI systems have a huge role to play in of course, thinking about building infrastructures for climate resilience, right? I mean, AI systems have a huge role to play in, for example, in hazard anticipation, in knowing when, in disaster preparedness, in anticipating, when disasters happen, knowing how to respond to them and being prepared for it. And of course, the hope is that at some point, with AI systems becoming, they're sort of widespread and cheap enough that people can access them and essentially as a part of their local communities, as a part of the communities and the cities that they live in, because our cities will effectively embed these technologies around us in seamless ways. So I think of this as all the discussions, for example, around building smart, sustainable cities, all these discussions around, better disaster preparedness and climate resilience fundamentally are implicating artificial intelligence in some way or another. And at some point, if these are cheap, that hopefully everyone should be able to benefit from them. We're very far away from that at the moment. And I think that's I think something that I think we know that we're far away from that, but that's something that accelerating those processes is clearly valuable. but yeah, I mean, I think I think different types of predictive modeling. So taking a more general approach of AI is just different flavors of predictive modeling. If we think also about climate models, and if we think about also the way in which we are understanding and measuring and forecasting the impacts of climate change for our societies, I mean, AI systems have a huge role to play in that as well, because they're thinking about predictive models of the impacts of climate change. I mean, large scale models are very much informing how we are thinking and quantifying those impacts as well. So in that sense, from a methodological standpoint, the way we measure the impacts of climate change, prepare for it, but also in the experiential community standpoint of being prepared for it, different AI systems have a role to play.
Raya, do you want to say anything or no? It's fine. So there's another question which is very general, and I think we could go for 1 more hour. So how to improve the positive effects of digitalization, asks Mohammed. With education. So
yeah.
Through education, no? How do we do that?
Yeah, I think the integration of the two is clearly, that's already happening, right? I mean, if we think about education today and the role of digital technologies and also within educational systems is crucial, right? I mean, so I think the way forward is also, I think, making digital literacy, particularly digital literacy and becoming more sensible consumers of a diversified information landscape as a part of training in digital literacy within educational systems, as I see a really important part of also stimulating the climate action discussion. I mean, the SDGs talk concretely about integrating climate awareness within education and educational systems, and I see as digital literacy and digital awareness as being crucial to that delivery. So I would say that's definitely the integration of the two is one way that we can sort of integrate and harness both those accelerators.
Yeah, maybe I just want to add that seeing the linkages between the SDG, also beyond these two that we were mentioning, like I think I mentioned a bit also something fundamental like nutrition. It's also the education and nutrition. It's something that we can't distinguish out from one another. It's true that I kind of stare a bit at mother with higher education, and then we tend to make sure that children would be doing well. But in fact, when children don't have enough food, they can't concentrate in school, and then this is something fundamental too. And then of course, other things that we should invest on in different dimensions at the same time. Then electricity, actually, also access to clean energy, some work of our colleagues also saw that it does interact access to clean energy with some education. It changed fertility patterns too, and there's a lot of evidence also on that side, and that's quite interesting too.
Okay, I think it's I don't see any more questions in the Q&A box. So I think it's time to wrap up. I want to give a round of applause to our speakers again for their excellent presentation and excellent discussion. Also to Narelle and Caroline, who were helped me with moderating the chat. Many thanks to all who are still online for your attention and participation today. I think we have learned a lot about the opportunities and challenges accompanying the two transformations, that of mass education and the digitalization. The new events for 2023 within this series will be announced on the website soon. You have seen the link in the chat. And bye-bye for now, and have a good afternoon. Enjoy the sun wherever you are. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Anne as well. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Anne. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.